Hello everyone, FPL Raptor here and welcome back to another video on my YouTube channel. In today's video, we're going to be discussing how to build the best possible team for Game Week 1 that will get you off to the strongest start so that hopefully you can stay there all season. If you do enjoy today's video, please do smash that like button, and if you are new around here, make sure to subscribe as well. But without further ado, let's jump into it. So I just wanted to say, if you clicked on this video as like a veteran of the game and you've played for many years and you're thinking, oh, I might click off, this probably isn't for me, I promise there'll be some value in here that you've probably not considered at some point, or just to remind yourself of ahead of Game Week 1, because we can get so fixated on drafts that we like and players that we want to pick that we forget these kind of macro points. We forget to zoom out and think about FPL as almost like a game of chess, which it is. And like I say, we get so engrossed with certain players. And so I think there'll be some value for you, even if you've played the game for a while. But I think especially if you're new to the game, and if you are, make sure to subscribe. I think this will be extremely useful. And the first tip is around price points and structure. And what I mean by that is obviously every player is a price. It's not just the player themselves. And you need to consider that you're going to have this rough structure unless you want to make multiple transfers for at least a few game weeks, right? If you've gone for a £5.5 million midfielder in that slot, unless you've left money in the bank, or unless you're planning on making, like I said, a couple of transfers, well, then you are stuck with a player around that price point. So not only do you need to consider who you are owning, you need to consider the price that you are owning that player at. So what is the next step for you with that spot? And like I said, it might be that your plan is to get through to sort of Game Week 3, Game Week 4, and then use a couple of transfers. Downgrade Isak or Watkins to a cheaper forward, and then upgrade a midfielder as just a hypothetical example. But I do think it's worth thinking about the structural price points of your team. I think as a result, it's nice to have a premium defender because you know that there are multiple defenders around that 6 million price tag. So having someone like Trent to start with, he's a nice price point, as well as being good himself. The other example that I've given here is actually Eze. And this is where sometimes we can become unstuck. So I think there are no other good £7 million midfielders, maybe other than Mbermo off the top of my head. So really it's just Eze. And you might say, well, Eze as a result isn't a good price point. But there are multiple extremely good £6.5 million midfielders. In fact, I did an entire video, you should go and watch it, where I talk about the best £6.5 million mids, and I found it very difficult. Garnacho, Szoboszlai, Nkunku, Johnson, Bailey, Gibbs-White, just off the top of my head, multiple really, really good options. And I think there will be some really good ones that emerge. Now, the issue that you've got is, let's say it's Leon Bailey. He's the best 6.5 mid, scores 2 goals in Game Week 1, scores a goal against Arsenal. You might have a plan to bring him in then in Game Week 3. But if you start with another £6.5 million midfielder, let's say Gibbs-White, and Gibbs-White does pretty poorly, Gibbs-White drops to 6.4, Bailey at that stage is going to be like 6.8 million if he's done that well. And then you can't go from Gibbs-White to Bailey because unless you've left money in the bank, you can't make that move. So the reason I like owning Eze is he's actually 0.5 above the price point that I think will be extremely useful and popular. So as a result, think about it in that manner. Think about what might my future moves be and what might a nice price point or structure in my team be to allow myself to facilitate those moves in the future. Like I said, FPL is a game of chess. And I think if you get hyper-fixated, I love Hudson-Odoi, which you might do, and he might do fantastically. But where do you go after that? There are some really good 5.5 mids, but like I said, if they start increasing in price and Hudson-Odoi drops or stays the same, it's going to be tricky to get there. So try to consider, once you've built a team that you like, do you have most of those major price points covered? Can you see yourself making moves quite easily in the future for players that might arise? And I think if you consider that, you'll allow yourself to not only have a strong start at the start of the season, but also maintain that throughout sort of game weeks 2, 3, 4, and beyond. So point number 2 feels like a fairly obvious one, and it probably is. However, it's one that I know myself, many managers, myself included, forget to remind ourselves of. And sometimes I'll build a draft and I'll go, wow, that is a seriously good draft. And I'll realize that maybe it's not because there are quite a few rotation risks. So the reason I think this is so critical, especially in Game Week 1, is in the first 3 game weeks, and I've just used 3 as a rough time frame, I think there will be at least 5 players that absolutely tear it up that you didn't consider and that you probably likely will want to get in. I mean, you might not want to get in all 5, but there'll be at least 2, 3 players that you're like, oh, I'd rather have them in my team right now. You're also going to get injuries and unforeseen issues. There will be multiple injuries at the start of the season because players have had a summer break and often their bodies aren't used to the Premier League sort of intensity. there are often a lot of early season injuries. So immediately, injuries, players you didn't consider, and unforeseen issues, there'll be players that just get dropped that you weren't expecting. Someone like an Mbermo, where you're like, they're so nailed, and then they just get benched randomly. It happens every season. So you'll get those unforeseen issues. And there's also fixture swings you want to target. In Game Week 2, you're going to want City players, Chelsea players. Game Week 3, you're going to want Ipswich players. You're going to want... We're going to discuss this in the future, but there are fixture swings that you'll want to target, as well as on top of the fact, all of those other things that might happen. So if you consider all of this happening over the opening games, it's absolutely chaotic. You don't want to also be using valuable transfers, putting out fires because you pick players that you knew full well probably wouldn't be starting. And I'm not saying for a second that you can't pick a few rotation risks. In my team, I've got them myself. Even the likes of Nkunku is a slight rotation risk. I've gone for Chris Wood in a lot of my drafts, João Pedro. These are rotation risks, but you don't want to stack them. I've seen a few drafts where it's got like Murphy in there and João Pedro and Wood, and I'm looking, it's like there's 3 or 4 of your attackers there could conceivably be benched in a single week, on top of having City assets and we never know if they're going to start or not. Having like the likes of Gakpo, it's just Havertz. These are all great picks that I've listed. None of those are bad, but you don't want to stack 4 or 5 of those in your team. I would argue you don't even want 3. I try to limit it, if possible, to 2 rotation risks, but also players that I do think will start. So I'm not picking them thinking they're going to be benched, but I'm picking them knowing full well that they could be rotated. And again, that sounds like such an obvious point, but I would urge you right now, as you're watching this video, don't click off, of course, but bring up your team and just look how many rotation risks do you have in your team. And if it's 3 or more, I would just wonder, can you bring in some slightly more nailed players to start the season until at least we can assess their minutes. And if their minutes are high, then of course you can look to bring them in. So very obvious point, but a very important one to remind ourselves of. So point number 3 is building on point number 2, but is perhaps even more important and something which we pay even less attention to in our teams. And that is limiting the unknowns. And it doesn't only refer to new signings, and it doesn't only refer to minutes risk. There are so many things that can make a player's performance unknown. And to be honest, every player's performance is unknown because we can't predict the future. But there are certain things that we might want to avoid having in an abundance. And it's very difficult. Once you think about the full list of things that are unknown, if you were to only have players that were known entities, you'd probably only be able to pick 4 good players. So this, more so than the other one, you could maybe have 4, maybe 5 unknowns. But again, you don't want a full team of unknowns because I feel like it could backfire horribly. So here is a list of things that I would class as unknowns. And I would love to know down below if I've missed anything, because I think I probably have. The first being promoted teams. We have seen in the past, last year, everyone said Burnley under Vincent Kompany will shock the Premier League. They play beautiful football. They're attacking. They won't just sit back and defend. They will shock teams. They didn't shock teams. They were pretty rubbish, in all honesty. Luton were the team that we were pretty shocked at attacking. And no one really saw that. Everyone was like, Burnley's going to attack. Luton will play a low block. Maybe if you watched Championship football the year before, you wouldn't have said that. But all I'm saying is promoted teams are difficult to predict. I don't think many people would have predicted the fight that Luton put up in comparison to a Burnley. And it might be that Ipswich outperform Leicester this year, or it might be that all of them have stinkers, or all of them finish mid-table. You just never really know. So I would struggle to pick many players from promoted teams. And this is the next one, which is difficult. It's teams with a new manager. But that is Liverpool. That is Chelsea. That is Brighton. There are a few teams that we'd want to own assets from, West Ham, that have new managers. There are quite a few new managers this season. So does that mean that you don't pick players? Absolutely not. But could you say, do you know what? Maybe 2 from Chelsea and 3 from Liverpool is not the best idea when we don't exactly know how they're going to perform under the new manager. It could go absolutely amazingly. They could start on fire, but do you want to maybe spread the risk a little bit? I would potentially say so. It's why I've not really had 3 Liverpool, and I've probably not had more than 1 Chelsea, because I'm just not sure how they're going to look. Same with Brighton. I'm a little bit worried about overloading on their assets. Also, it's not just teams with a new manager, it's teams with like major overhauls. And what I mean by that is they've sold various of their starting 11, or at least 1 or 2 of their key players. And on top of that, maybe they've had a formation change that we've seen in pre-season. Teams that just look like they're going into a new era with their team and that they've lost a few key assets. I think Fulham could do very well this season, but they've lost Paulinho, and that's a huge loss to them. Aston Villa sold Douglas Luiz. They've replaced him with Onana, so they should be pretty solid defensively. But might that affect them going forward? We don't know. There are other teams that have sold multiple assets, and it's being wary with teams where we don't really know exactly how they're going to line up. Like Arsenal are the best example of a team that you just know. They've got the same kind of players. They've got the same manager. They'll play a very similar set of tactics. Yes, there might be a little bit more rotation this year with squad depth, but they're largely a known entity, whereas teams that have had a major overhaul are just not sure. Also, players that are returning from injury. I am fine. Like, I've got Nkunku in my latest draft. It's okay to have a few of them, but you don't want to load up on players that have fitness issues and that are returning from injury, especially if they've got an injury record that isn't particularly strong. Rumours of transfer. There are rumours that Mikalenko might leave. It's okay to have him in, though, but you don't want then rumours of someone else that might leave and another one that might leave. You don't want to start loading them up. Like, you wouldn't want to go for Solanke if there are still strong rumours that he might move to Spurs, although it'd be a pretty good signing. Tony, unless we know he's definitely staying, maybe you don't want to start there just in case he moves away from the Prem. Mikalenko, like I said, is another option. There are multiple players where there are quite a few rumours around whether they'll stay or go. It's maybe not the best idea to start with multiple of them. Position uncertainty. Heung-min Son springs to mind. I just don't know if he's going to start on the left or through the centre. It might not matter. But players where maybe Szoboszlai is a decent example of one that you might want to not go for because he could play a little bit deeper or he could play as the number 10. And also minutes uncertainty as well. We don't know whether some players are going to play every game, whether they're going to start every game. And as always, it's worth picking one or two of them, as I've just spoken about, but you don't want to pick multiple of those. So it could quite easily stack up. I've seen drafts that I've built where it's like, I've probably got 7 unknowns in my starting 11. At that stage, I'm like, can I pick a few more players that I know what you're going to get, or at least I think I know what I'm going to get. And there's a little bit more stability with the team, with the manager, and with the player themselves. So again, go back to your drafts. How many unknowns do you have? If it's more than 5 or 6, and especially if they're quite big unknowns, I would question if you can put a few more like glue guys in there. Guys that you just know you can keep for a long period of time. They stay fit. There's not much uncertainty around them. Like Bruno Fernandes. Manchester United, there's a little bit of uncertainty, but you just know he's going to get minutes. He stays fit. Bukayo Saka is another really good example. There are players that you can rely on. Maybe try and stick with a few more of those and just limit the unknowns, at least for the first few game weeks. So tip number 4 is around bench cover, and I've put having some bench cover. I actually think the biggest mistake that people make is not having too much, it's actually having not enough. But there is a really fine balance because you'll also see some people that have got like Bruno Fernandes on their bench, and I'm like, what are you doing with all of that money invested on your bench? So how would I look at this? The first point, and again an obvious point, is you only get points from 11 players each week. So every week you are benching 4 players, 3 outfielders that you are not getting the value from in your starting 11. So you don't want to have tons of points left on your bench every week. And people will say, and I am one of those people, that it is only psychological. Points on your bench is a psychological thing. You're not losing points as long as you weren't really considering playing them and you're happy with your starting 11. You're not losing them. It's just tough to look at. But also, if you've got tons of points on your bench because your bench players are so expensive, well, then I think you are losing points because you've not invested that money into your starting 11. So I've said here, putting too much of your budget on your bench is essentially leaving points on the table. Because if you've invested an extra 4 million on the bench that would have allowed you to go from Nkunku to Palmer, and Palmer absolutely destroys Nkunku, well, then you look at that and you go, well, yeah, maybe I've left some points on the table. So there is a fine balance. But you also need and want depth early on to cover issues that might arise. We've spoken about already. There are so many unknowns and things that can crop up with injuries and unforeseen issues and fixture swings and suspensions. Let's say that you start the season with Mikalenko and Livramento. Livramento ends up not starting at all, and Mikalenko gets sent off in game week 1. Yes, you are going to have to remove Livramento, absolutely, because that's an issue. And Mikalenko you might want to remove because he's out for 3 games or whatever. But you might not want to do that in game week 2. You might not want to do it in game week 3. You might want to not even do it in game week 4. You might want to focus your transfers on the attack. Having someone like Murillo and Barco on the bench, you might allow yourself the opportunity to delay that transfer 1 or 2 weeks. What you don't want, and this is what happens with a weak bench, is one issue arises and you have to deal with that immediately with a transfer. You may well choose to. Let's say you start with Livramento and he doesn't play, and Lewis Hall plays at left back and looks fantastic. You might say, that is a transfer that justifies making now. I want that transfer made now, which is fine. You've got the privilege of being able, I don't know, privilege is the word I want to, but you've got the ability to do that, but you don't want to be forced into doing that. And if you have a really decent bench, it allows you to not. And you can see here, I have only overspent from the minimum budget defence by 0.5 million. Because I've got a £4 million goalkeeper, I've got a £4 million defender, and I've got a £4.5 million forward. But the reason this bench is good is Fabianski probably won't play, but I don't think any of the 4s will. You don't need a backup keeper, in my opinion. Murillo is a very solid 4.5 defender that you can play pretty much every week. The reason I've got him rather than someone like Anderson or Leif Davis or anyone else is there are weeks where you really wouldn't want to play them. Other than Liverpool in game week 4, I think you can play Murillo in every single game and you'd be okay doing it because Forest's data last season was very good, and they've got really nice opening set of 8 to 10 fixtures. You could even go for Esri Konsa if you wanted here. You just wouldn't want to play him probably in game week 2, but it's a very similar thing where you can play them every week. Barco looks like he could be an absolute gem at 4 million, but you could go for a safer option in someone like Wout Fass, or you could go for Greaves, I think it is, at Ipswich. Looks like he could be an okay option. There are multiple options you can go for, but you want a 4 million pound defender that almost feels like they could be 4.5 because you feel like they offer good value. And maybe Barco is a bit of a minutes risk and you might not want to go there. But then you've got 2 defenders which could fill in for you if you want. And hopefully a 4.5 forward or midfielder will arise as being the very best option. But Stewart looks like he could get some minutes with Che Adams leaving at Southampton. It doesn't look very likely because I think they signed a new striker. Southampton are in their process of, but it's a bench where if you need it, you could call on them. I don't think you ever want to get down to your third bench option. I think if your starting 11 is in a position where you're losing 2 or 3 players a week, you probably do need to use those transfers, but you want at least one strong first sub. So that would be my opinion. Have a 4.5 defender on the bench, and outside of that, go super cheap. But make sure that 4.5 defender plays every week, very nailed, in which case you're probably looking at a centre-back most of the time, and has good fixtures almost every week. You don't want them to have tricky fixtures half the time, because in the weeks that you might want to rely on them, well, then they might have a tricky fixture. So Murillo, Mikalenko, Konsa probably stand out as the 3 for me that you're happy playing most weeks. Let me know down below in the comments, how much money do you have invested in your bench? Do you think this is too weak, too strong? And what's your sort of philosophy around bench players and bench cover? So point number 5 is broadly around planning ahead, but it's more so about fixture swings and looking at when specific teams start to have better fixtures and when you might want to own them and thinking about whether you can get ahead. And I spoke about in the 10 biggest mistakes video. If you've not watched that, by the way, and you're enjoying this video, that's a very similar styled video where it's focusing on the 10 things that you want to try to avoid doing. I said you don't want to stick to a plan too rigidly and plan too far ahead, but you want to have some idea about when do the players in your team right now start to have tricky fixtures? When do the players that you don't own start to have better fixtures? And like I said, can you get 1 or 2 game weeks ahead? Because if you always wait until just when the fixtures swing, you will sometimes miss some of those early price rises and early returns because often players will start to return just before they go into a nice fixture run, and you kind of want to get on them ahead of time. I remember last season I managed to do that with Alexander Isak just ahead of a really nice set of fixtures at the end of the season for Newcastle. I jumped on him a few weeks early and he did very, very well. So an example that I'll use here is Ollie Watkins. Ollie Watkins has really nice fixtures from game week 3 onwards. He's got West Ham and Arsenal in the opening 2. There is an extremely strong chance, I think, that most people will want to get Ollie Watkins from game week 3 onwards. Maybe not. But let's say he gets 1 or 2 goals against West Ham and Arsenal. Not only do you have him in place and don't have to use a transfer to bring him in, but you also, on top of that, get the points from the first 2 game weeks. So it's like a win-win situation there, and maybe even some price rises too. Esri Konsa is another player that I have had on the bench in a lot of my drafts, because I just think from game week 3 onwards, Villa have, again, really nice fixtures, and many people will be looking and thinking, do you know what, I could do with an Aston Villa defender, because you can play them pretty much every week. We know that City and Chelsea have really good fixtures from game week 2, as do Fulham. They play against Leicester and Ipswich in 2 and 3. Ipswich themselves, you might say I don't want an Ipswich defender, but Leif Davis could be a really nice option that has good fixtures from game week 3. If you've got someone like Livramento or Murillo in your team, could you tuck Leif Davis on the bench that you could start playing from game week 3 onwards? So I think it's really important to start looking at future fixture swings. And I think you could also go the other way, by the way. Like, it's a very fine art trying to jump on a player slightly ahead of the curve, gaining a little bit of their points before, making sure that you've got them in place. But you also don't want to go too early, because what you don't want to do is bring in a player that's got 2 awful fixtures before a nice fixture run when you're not expecting anything from them. But if you're starting to see that they're performing well and they've got okay fixtures and you can see that everyone's going to want them in this game week, can you get slightly ahead of that? And I think timing when you bring players in, well, it is comfortably the most important thing in FPL, right? Even more important than something like captaincy. Timing of when you own players is critical, because there will be times when no one has them that they do well, when everyone has them that they don't do well. So yeah, I think this is something to think about. I'm not saying always go early, but if you can get, especially in game week 1, right, you've essentially got a wild card. Can you tuck a couple of players on your bench that have good fixtures from game week 2, 3, 4 onwards, that maybe don't have the best opening fixtures? And also, can you have 1 or 2 players in your team that don't have perfect opening fixtures? Everyone's going to go for Gibbs White because he's got better fixtures than Bailey. But from game week 3 onwards, I'd rather have Bailey. So could you go for someone like that instead? And like I said, be slightly ahead of the curve. It's a difficult one to do, and I still struggle with this, But in the seasons that I've done especially well, my timing of players has been slightly earlier than everyone else. And I think that's how you can start to get slightly ahead of the curve. So think about in Game Week 1, who are some players that others will want from Game Week 3 onwards that you can start with and hopefully get ahead. So point number 6 is actually very closely linked to point number 5 about future fixture swings and also planning ahead. But more specifically in this case, rotations. And I did allude to that in the previous one, but I think this deserves its own point, because it's just how you can avoid feeling like you need to make early transfers. Because what we'll do is we'll build a team that we really like for Game Week 1, maybe even look towards Game Week 2 or 3. And then Game Week 4 will swing around. And I've done this myself many a time, even in recent years. You'll look at your team in Game Week 4 and all of a sudden you're like, oh my goodness, like half my team play against each other. All of my defenders play against Liverpool, City and Arsenal. What was I thinking? Like, my team looks awful this week. And then you feel like, because everyone wants a perfect team every week, which is a mistake itself. I spoke about that again in the 10 mistakes video. But because you feel like you don't want to play a 4.5 defender against a pretty difficult team, you then feel like you've got to make a transfer to get around that. So what I would advise you to do is make sure you have looked at how your defenders, and especially if you're rotating cheap attackers like Rodgers and Muniz, rotate beautifully. How do your defenders rotate? And I think once you can, especially across at least 6 games, potentially 10, once you work out the rotations, it might be that you have to pick a slightly different player to the one you want, but you know then at least every single week, as long as they can stay fit and they play, you've got a solid option. So I'm going to give you 2 examples here. You might not have even considered these players, but Konsa and Dunk, I think, are both very good picks. Dunk is extremely attacking for a centre-back. Konsa playing for a good defence, also with good fixtures. If you pick the 2 of them, on paper, you'd say Konsa and Dunk are 2 very, very solid picks. But as you can see here, they've got really tricky fixtures in 2, 7, 10 and 11. So I'll jump over to Fantasy Football Hub to show you how I look at this. So let's say I've built this team. Ignore the team largely because it's just a team I've roughly put together. And then I've got Trent and Gvardiol as 2 of my starting defenders. But let's say, hypothetically, I start those every week regardless of fixtures. And what I want to do is rotate this final slot here. I want Konsa to rotate with Dunk. That's the pair that I've chosen. In Game Week 1, I mean, immediately you've not got a great fixture. You could play Dunk if you wanted to against Everton, but it's Everton or West Ham away. It's okay. Game Week 2, you immediately come into a slight issue here. Dunk's got Manchester United and Konsa's got Arsenal. So immediately I would look at it and think, if I've chosen those 2 players, I go into Game Week 2 here having to choose a player with a tricky fixture regardless. And you would probably choose Dunk here, but you're not expecting a clean sheet at all. Game Week 3, fine, I can play Konsa against Leicester, got Dunk against Arsenal, that rotation works fine. Remember, I said it actually goes through okay until about Game Week 7. You've then got Konsa against United or Dunk against Spurs. Not an awful set of fixtures, but not one you'd necessarily want. And you might think, I don't need to plan until Game Week 10. But why would you not try at least if you can pick a pair that rotate well most weeks? So Konsa's got Spurs away here, Dunk's got Liverpool away. That's not a fixture you want. Game Week 11. Konsa's got Liverpool, Dunk's got City. And at this stage, you are forced to make a transfer, right? So it might be that you want to make a transfer by then. There might be a 4.5 that arises that is an absolutely fantastic option. But why not choose a rotation that you know will serve you for the longest spell period in case you just want to keep rolling transfers and then using the valuable ones that you've got on the attack? I'd much rather be in that position than just picking any old 4.5 defenders. If you want to know who I think are the best defenders to rotate, I did upload a video. Just type in FPL Raptor best £4.5 million defenders or best budget defenders or something like that. I went through the budget rotations at 4.5 and there are some really nice rotations. For example, Livramento and Robinson rotate beautifully. Like if you were to choose those 2 instead, I'll actually briefly show you here just as an option. So rather than Konsa, we go for Livramento. Like I said, you can get access to Fantasy Football Hub. There's 50% off if you use the link in the description. So Livramento comes in. And rather than Dunk, I go for Robinson. By the way, I really like Robinson as an option. So guys, I decided to just, random cut there, I decided to just plug them all in every week so that you could just see rather than going through them, you go, well, who's got the better fixture? Because it took like 3 minutes for me to work out. Anyway, so Livramento, Game Week 1, you play against Southampton. Game Week 2, Robinson against Leicester at home. Game Week 3, Ipswich away for Robinson. And each of these weeks, the other player's not got the best fixture. The rotation just works perfectly. Livramento's got Spurs that week, obviously. Robinson against West Ham at home. Livramento against Fulham. This is a week where obviously they play against each other, of course. Then Robinson against Forest away. Then in the week that Robinson's got City, you can play Livramento. Then you can play Livramento again. Then it's Robinson. You can see they rotate quite well. I'm up to game week 11 now. They've got good fixtures. You can keep going, by the way. It gets to about game week sort of 15, 16 before you have any real issue. And it might be that these 2, like Livramento might not play that much and it might become a bad option. It's just one example where it's a much better rotation than if you were to go for Duncan Concert just as a random one. So please do use Fantasy Football Hub, look ahead, plan your rotations, because these are the small details that will allow you to have a really good start to the season or be scrambling and using your valuable free transfers on 4.5 to vendors. So guys, there we have it. Those are 6 top tips that will allow you to get the best possible start to the season, in my opinion. I do usually start fast, although last year I had a bit of a stinker, so hopefully I can recover this year and start really, really well. And if you did get any value out of today's video, please do smash that like button and also consider subscribing as well. I would really appreciate it. Until next time, thank you very much for watching. Bye-bye.